Lastly, we're going to talk about this time period, again, that I referred to as the Gilded Age. So between 1860 to 1920, cities are growing. Okay, we just talked about that. For example, Chicago grows from 109,000 in 1860 to 1.1 million in 1890. Southern Florida, they start draining the swamps, and Miami becomes the Magic City. So, factors contributing to this urbanization, of course, is the growing number of immigrants, the increased industrialization and trade, the railroad system, declining crop prices, and the new opportunities that are there. They also create these things called boarding houses, where you could go pay rent and you would have a room that was yours, and you would be fed, and you would have some socialization. Okay, you can meet new people. And there was a wide variety of entertainment at this time, too. So things like vaudeville, which is a type of show featuring a variety of special acts, okay? A lot of dancing, a lot of opera, those kinds of things. Streetcars, which are a main form of transportation in urban centers, are vehicles that run on rails through city streets and carries passengers. Okay, so localized trains, essentially. They fostered the development of the city's central district. So people could travel to and from the city to shops and work, and then could go back out to these new places called suburbs to live a more peaceful, quiet life, get away from the dinge of the city. Suburbs are communities that are built around the city's edge, and they were made possible through the improvements in transportation, like with streetcars and eventually buses and things like that. The city's central districts begin to grow, and they featured businesses like banks, railroad terminals, and department stores, which is a store that offered a wide variety of merchandise all in one location. If you ever are able to go to New York City, you very much can feel that when you're there. These magnificent railroad terminals that welcome you into the city, and then you come above ground and there are all these shops and stores. As population grew, housing became a major problem. So when the cities couldn't spread out, they began to build up. So the use of steel framework allowed to build the first skyscrapers. The first one is built in Chicago in the 1880s and is 10 stories tall. And then soon they were soaring to 30 floors high. The invention of the commercial electric elevator really allowed this to happen. Prior to the elevator, you wouldn't build a building much above 5 stories. But once elevators are created, you can start going higher and higher. Many couldn't afford to live in the spacious apartments in the skyscrapers or in the suburbs. So most of those people lived in the tenements that I had talked about earlier. So these are tenement housing right here. You had the Flatiron Building in New York City, which is kind of an architectural marvel at that time. And then this is the original skyscraper built in Chicago. The gentleman who actually built this is the man who was behind the creation of many of the buildings at the World's Fair in 1893 that we saw Tesla's lights powering. Rapid urban growth led to concerns among public health officials and social reformers. Prior to 1895, sanitation or proper waste disposal and a system for providing clean water just did not exist in cities. So you had manure, because horses are mainly pulling carriages and things, garbage, they're all accumulating on the streets. Noxious fumes are coming from the factories. Poor neighborhoods were susceptible to outbreaks of illness. They were fire prone, and just a general increase in crime because it was just so dirty, and it just made it a lot easier to do those kinds of things. There was also widespread corruption. So we had the political machines in cities that were kind of running things, and this was an agreed upon exclusive power structure that involved city officials bribing politicians, contractors, and constituents to keep the city running. It was efficient, but it was incredibly corrupt. And this Gilded Age that we're talking about is really this time period between the 1870s and 1900. And it's mainly marked by political corruption and this immense excess of wealth. The term Gilded Age actually is coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. The wealth masks the greed and corruption of industry and politicians. Okay, this image, this cartoon, we're going to take a closer look at in class, has actually been circulating a lot again here recently, as the question about wealth and the people who have it and their role in society with those who are helping them amass that wealth is becoming a question again. Many believe the government did not do enough to solve the problems that were stemming from this urbanization crisis. In the 1890s, different reform movements began to organize, and they were mostly native-born, middle-class white Protestant, and women were heavily involved in the reform movements. They believed that society was responsible for the common good of all of its citizens. Social ills resulting from industrial growth and political corruption needed to be addressed, and if the government wasn't going to do it, the people were. This becomes known as progressivism, this belief in progress, a term used to describe these reform movements, this idea of forward-looking. Some focused on living conditions, others child labor, some focused on corrupt employers and government, but they all shared similar goals, and that was addressing social problems, things like poverty, exploitation or the using of people, corruption, and expanding democracy. Giving the vote to women, for example, will come out of these reform movements. News of these issues spread throughout the country thanks to those journalists, those muckrackers that we were talking about. Progressive reforms hoped to clean up the government through new laws that gave citizens the right to initiate these referendums, which are public votes on individual issues. And this was one way to keep the political machines from gaining too much power. And today referendums are still a thing in most state governments. After the end of Reconstruction, southern states and communities passed laws meant to keep or to undermine reforms. We call it the Black Nadir, which is the lowest point since the end of the Civil War, and it was the period that was marked by a lot of racial violence, legalized discrimination in the South, restricted opportunities, and political participation. They attacked the 15th Amendment, which was that all men have the right to vote. Okay, sorry, ladies, Native Americans still can't vote. And we've talked about these things, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but things like poll taxes, okay? The Grandfather Clause, which is a clause that states that those who had the right to vote prior to 1866 or 1867, or their direct descendants, were not subject to some or all of the voting requirements. So this allowed poor whites to vote, but not African Americans. They used literacy tests. Okay, the first one actually was used to discourage Irish immigrants in 1855 in Connecticut from voting, and voter intimidation, and we talked about the KKK. Racial discrimination existed throughout the country, but was most rampant throughout the South. And segregation, which is the separation of different groups of people, usually based on race, ran rampant throughout the South. They were legally separated in schools, restrooms, theaters, restaurants, public transportation. A lot of times there were separate doors into businesses or hospitals or courthouses. And of course, Jim Crow laws, which were laws that were established that enforced racial segregation across the southern states. It took those black codes and turned it into law. Jim Crow was a fictional character in a minstrel show, actually. He was passed off as a dim-witted comic relief. Many times they were white actors dressed in blackface, and he was always the butt of the joke. And you can actually see there's an image of Jim Crow, the character. In 1896, Louisiana passes the Separate Car Act. They say it's equal but separate accommodations on the train. The act did not define the meaning of white or African American. So in enters Homer Plessy, who was only an eighth African American. Most historians say if you met Homer Plessy today, you wouldn't even be sure if he truly was black. So he sat in the white's car, was told to move, he refused, and was arrested. This leads to a major Supreme Court case. And this Supreme Court case establishes how segregation and civil rights are going to be handled until the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling in 1954 that desegregated schools. So Plessy versus Ferguson is this Supreme Court case, and it ruled that the Separate Car Act did not violate the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection of the law, if the railroad offered separate accommodations, even if they were not equal. Okay? The major dissent was from Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he said, I am of the opinion that the statute of Louisiana is inconsistent with the personal liberties of citizens, white and black, in that state, and hostile to both the spirit and the letter of the Constitution of the United States. However, the Supreme Court upheld the practice of segregation, and they allowed this idea of separate but equal, a policy that allowed businesses and institutions to segregate African Americans from whites as long as the facilities or services provided were about equal. This is, again, it remains in practice from 1896 to 1954 when schools are finally desegregated. So African Americans become very self-reliant. And the response to segregation was that they were trying to make these changes within the system. Some were, and some were openly protesting. So the man that you see on your screen is Booker T. Washington. He was an educator. He was an educated African American. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1881, which trained African Americans to be teachers. We saw that George Washington Carver, the man that went to Iowa State, he becomes a professor there, a teacher there. And he really promotes this idea of self-reliance. You know, if you work hard, you are a good person, okay, you will be accepted. He did not believe in trying to reform systematic racism. And he believed the best way was to win respect of whites and prove yourself worthy. This man, on the other hand, Webb Du Bois, he believed protest was the best path toward equality and ending segregation. So I know many of us have a familiarity with MLK and Malcolm X, okay? This man would be the MLK of this time period, the peaceful, like hard work, those kinds of things, where Webb Du Bois is more like Malcolm X, who's more of a militant figure. He believed that Washington, he's referring to Booker T. Washington, he believed that his beliefs promoted bigotry rather than deterred it. And in 1903, he founded the Niagara Movement, which was an organization that attacked Booker T. Washington's ideas, but it quickly died out in 1909. So in 1909, he co-founds the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and he serves as a director working with Jane Hall from the Hull House in Chicago.